All right, this is going to be a fun one on psychedelics and the Messiah complex or ego inflation. So first off, I'm writing like a long form article on this that's going to go a lot more into depth. So if this interests you, sign up for my newsletters. Well, it's actually my Substack, link below. So definitely subscribe to that. If this interests you, there will be a lot more kind of resources and a lot more depth of an exploration. But I just wanted to make this video quick. I've been getting requests for it, and so here it is. So I think there are many factors in this, but I think the key is to understand how belief formation happens, right? How ego inflation happens, all of this. It happens not through rationality, but through feelings. Essentially, we are feeling driven. Most of our behavior in life, most of the decisions we make are actually primarily driven by our feelings, and then we rationalize them. We create it like a rationale. We create ideas that will make sense of our feelings. And so to set this stage, for why this Messiah complex comes up, we first have to understand the feelings we already have, kind of our baseline. And I think a lot of people suffer from these feelings of insignificance, right? Of not having a really important life, a really important role in the world. There's actually a Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker, which explores these two fears that we have, right? This fear of death, of, mortality, that our lives are finite, and this fear of insignificance, that we fear, being forgotten, not having a lasting impact on the world. And Ernest Becker thinks that this is what really drives us as humans, these two fears. And I see this being true partially. I don't think it's the only drives we have or the only things that drive us. But undeniably, these are massive fears and massive drives. Now, when people will do psychedelics, they will often have this feeling of transcendence, a feeling of divinity, a feeling of connection with the divine or connection with the natural world or connection with themselves. These things are in huge contrast to our normal waking sense of consciousness, which is, by comparison, extremely isolated and I will say maybe a lot less significant. So by less significant here, I mean like smaller seeming. Like it just doesn't feel as important. It doesn't feel just as lively or meaningful. And when you have these big experiences, and I've had a few of them, there is this very real, this feeling that like is completely impossible to describe because it feels so much more amazing and significant and meaningful than anything I had experienced before it. So I think this is a really big point, that we go around most of our lives feeling, pretty small in comparison, right? I don't know what the right way to describe this, but, feeling pretty normal, you might say, right? We all assume more or less that people are having this normal experience of feeling like, themselves, feeling like a normal human. And then when we have this feeling, or at least when I had this feeling of transcendence, of one with the universe, of just like this brilliant, beautiful light just radiating through my whole being, that felt so much more significant. And by contrast, I felt very important. Now, I think one of the things here is because I had experienced the world in a very kind of narrow way previously, you could say, by comparison. I had assumed everyone else had experienced the world like that as well, right? And so when I had this experience, there was like an unconscious assumption that everyone else was like normal and that I no longer felt normal. I felt, connected with the universe. I felt this real sense of significance. And then in my mind, what automatically happened is like, I didn't think of it this way, but I can now reflect and see that this is what was happening, was that I felt myself to be special, right? To have some experience or some understanding that made me more special than other people. And luckily, because I had, studied a lot of spiritual traditions and studied with some really great teachers previously, this feeling did not last for me. It didn't even last a few days. I mean, I was still feeling that like high of connection, but I was self-aware enough to realize that I was making myself more important or making myself bigger, that it was feeding my ego. And the problem is that the ego only serves to keep us more separate. It only serves to divide us more from one another. It is actually in direct opposition from the experience that I had. So I had this feeling of universal connection, And then my ego turned that into a sense of self-importance, which then separated me from the universal connection. And this is the irony of it, that the experience is trying to show us, hey, we're all interconnected. We are all one. We are all significant. It's really, that's really what I take from it, is that this is all significant. Everything is significant. Every experience, every person, every tree, it's all significant, right? And there's no I am more significant or that person is more significant. It's all significant. It is all one in a sense, or it's all, an expression of the same kind of one energy. I really don't have the words to describe it. But then our mind, our ego, what it does is it turns that into an idea, into a concept, into us trying to make ourselves feel better against that former feeling of insignificance. Now, this is a really well-known phenomena in Buddhism, in particular lineages of Buddhism, especially. So Chogyam Trungpa, kind of a great Buddhist teacher in Tibetan Buddhism, he came to the West. And when he started teaching Westerners, he realized that people were using spirituality to kind of inflate their ego, to make themselves feel more important or more special or better than other people. So the very first book he wrote within his first year of being in the Western world was called Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism. And he was really trying to cut people down, cut down their egos, to show them that spirituality is not about inflating your ego, not about making a sense of self-importance. And when it does that, it's actually counter to the goals of spirituality. Now, in Zen Buddhism, there's this term called Makyō, which is illusion. And people will often have these great experiences of light and bliss and connecting with the divine, and all these beautiful things happen, and they'll go tell their teacher, and their teacher will be like, Makyō. And the teacher is saying, illusion. That's illusion too. Even these really beautiful experiences that are profound and feel very meaningful are still not the ultimate reality that we're looking for. And the reason they do this, why they're so adamant about this approach in Zen, is because they've seen how dangerous it is to put importance on spiritual experiences, that it is so easy to turn these into these self-aggrandizing or self-inflating experiences, and that is so counter to the actual goals of Buddhism, which is actually overcoming the self, overcoming the kind of egoic mind that is always trying to make meaning and importance out of things, because it is actually that which keeps us separate from the world and separate from other people. And that the real way we progress is to not continue to make these mental models of the world, to not continue to make an identity out of our experience, but instead to keep tearing away or shedding the layers of identity, shedding the layers of who we think we are, to come to a more direct experience of who we are. That is not an idea, that is not an identity, that cannot be put into words, that cannot be communicated, that can only really be experienced. And so I'm very grateful that I had these perspectives from a long, past of studying Buddhism before I had these big experiences with psychedelics, because I could immediately see that I was having these really profound, really beautiful, really enriching and significant experiences, and I could see my mind immediately, without skipping a beat, turning this into this story, this narrative, and this self-view, right? An identity of self-importance, of significance. And when I realized that was happening, I was then able to separate the narrative, the story that my mind made, from the actual experience. And I looked at the experience, and I looked, okay, here's this beautiful feeling of light, of connection. And is that feeling, is there anything in that experience that would mean the story is true? The story I'm creating in my head is I am important, or, whatever it is, I am the Messiah, Is there anything in the actual felt sense of the experience that is telling me that's true? And I realized, no, that is a conditioned thing. That given the culture I grew up in, given, the kind of landscape of spirituality that, we live in the Western world, knowing that there are these prophets and saints that we worship, and, they sit up on these, big chairs and give their teachings, and, we revere them, and, we have figures like Jesus Christ or the Buddha. It's having figures like those, when we have these experiences, my immediate thought was oh, must be what they experienced, and therefore I am like them, right? But you'll see that those figures typically did not think of themselves as these like exalted, special people. You know, they were actually very humble. I mean, depending on who we're talking about and depending on, you know, what texts we read. But I think that a lot of them, for the most part, were very humble. We're not trying to make things about them. That it was actually their followers who made things about the person, right? And then we just naturally, growing up in the world we grew up in, have this idea of these like prophets who are very special and important. And when we have this experience of like transcendent, like experience of God or whatever you want to call it, it's really hard not to make that meaning that I am some significant person now, that I, you know, was gifted this for a special reason because I am special. Chogyam Trungpa, in his book, Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism, said, we actually have to give up the idea of being special. And I know that it's kind of a tough thing to work with, because on one hand, we are special. I think we're all special. But the idea that I am special means that these other people aren't special, right? Like that's kind of the meaning of special. It's like different from or above others or more significant than, right? And the idea that I am more important or special only serves to separate me from others, only serves to separate me from the world. You know, then I end up even more isolated, even more in my head, even more separate. But when we give up the idea of specialness, when we can see that everything is profound and beautiful and luminous and radiant, and that there is no more or less special or more or less meaningful, that everyone and everything is really beautiful and important. It's like when we can start to see that, then we start to really feel more of a sense of okayness, right? More of a sense of who we really are. So I've noticed in my life very clearly that the more I take myself out of the equation, the better my life is. In the sense of, I used to, you know, want to make a really comfortable life, have all these nice things in my life. Like my drive was about making my situation, my quality of life better. That was my primary drive at a point in my life. And over time, I became less focused on my own well-being and more focused on having a meaningful contribution to the world, on impacting others in a good way. Part of this was because I was very depressed and nothing was making me feel better anyways. And I just decided like, hey, if nothing I do is making me feel better, then why am I even trying? Why don't I instead try to have a meaningful life? And at least a meaningful life is better than a non-meaningful life, right? Because if I wasn't going to be able to have a happy life, at least I could have a meaningful life, right? At least I could contribute something good to the world. And then that shift in mentality was what actually got me out of my depression. The more I oriented towards the well-being of others, the more I felt just better overall. You know, I felt just more connected to other people, more connected to the world. My depression slowly lifted. My restlessness kind of subsided a lot. I felt like a lot of my ADHD and restlessness prior was actually because my whole body mind was telling me something's really wrong here. And as I oriented more towards having a meaningful impact on the world, I felt more connected to the world, felt more connected to myself, and that feeling of something is wrong, that like anxiety, restlessness feeling really subsided. And so yes, I was orienting more towards the collective good, right? But I also wasn't not caring for myself. And I think this is the other important thing, is to find this balance, that it's not about putting others above us or not about putting ourselves below others. It's just finding this nice reciprocal kind of balanced relationship where we are giving to the world, you know, we are giving meaningful things, but we're also receiving, right? I think we have to let ourselves receive, you know, what we need from the world, like, you know, like payment for our services, or receive care, or just receive like food, shelter, like all of these things. And just really receive the presence of others and the care of others and, you know, the gifts that others have to give us, and really balance that with what we give, right? So many people feel isolated now, you know, feel a lack of meaning in their lives. And I really think this is like kind of the first step we could take, maybe the most important step towards a more meaningful life, towards feeling more connected, more a part of the world, less isolated. And again, the irony is that when you have these really ego-inflating experiences, you know, they feel really important and you feel connected and significant, but you start to lose connection, actually. Yeah, you feel connected to this idea and this identity of like importance and this idea of like God or whatever. but you actually start to lose the connection with what's right in front of you, right? And my old therapist said that she could tell if someone was having psychosis versus a genuine spiritual awakening by looking in their eyes and just seeing if they're really present with her or if they're like lost in some idea. And I think that's the real thing, is like we get so into this idea of like, we're going to save the world. We're the chosen ones, you know, like we are God experiencing themselves. And we lose touch with what's right in front of us, right? We lose touch with the people, you know, with nature, just like being really present, out of our heads, out of our ideas. Those are all filters that only serve to separate us further. What we really want to do is like learn to let go of all ideas, right? All ideas. You know, some ideas can be helpful and crutches and for sure lead us in the right direction, don't get me wrong. But ultimately, the more present we can be without a filter, without an idea, without thinking that, you know, I am this and they are that, but to just really be present, that is where the real gifts of life lie. All right, so I think that's good for this topic for now. It's a very rich topic, so I'm sure I'll touch on it again in the future. And again, check out my Substack. I already have some articles on there, and I will be releasing one on this topic, but in more depth, kind of talking more about the Buddhist approach, the kind of non-identity stuff, a lot more some of the particular like mentors and thinkers I like in this realm that I think are really helpful to explore. So sign up for the Substack and see you again next time.